Hi, welcome to my November wrap-up. So I started 17 books in November and I only DNF'd 5 of them, which I think is pretty good going. And that is a much higher number simply because a lot of the books I read this month were novellas, which isn't cheating because they're still books, but they were novellas. They took much less time to read. I'm only going to be talking about some of the books that I read this month simply because I did Mixtapeathon this month, and that is a whole separate video. So the books that I read for Mixtapeathon will be coming next week after? Don't know, haven't edited it yet, don't know when I'm going to get around to it. December, at some point, the videos will come out. We're going to go through these in rating order. We've got a couple, more than a couple of 2 stars this month, which is quite unusual because normally if I think a book is going to be less than 3 stars, I will DNF it because who has the time? But a lot of my reading this month was audiobooks. So it's much easier to put down a physical book and just say, ugh, can't be bothered with that. But when you're stuck on a bus or waiting for a bus for an hour and a half, you can listen to the shit audio or listen to the one playlist that you had downloaded on Spotify because your data is shit. So I listened to the shit audiobooks and I finished them off. Let's start with the DNFs. Oh, where do I start? Okay, let's start with The Fair Folk by Marvin Kay. This was an anthology that I put on my TBR for October as part of like my spooky TBR. It's an anthology of stories about the fair folk that I've had lying around for a little while now. It's got a couple of authors that I know and like in it who've written stories for it. And I was intrigued because the fae is, it's not my thing, but it's something I'm interested in. I like elements of fae and fair folk lore in my fantasy. And the appeal of an anthology was getting 6 different points of view when it comes to fae stories and how fae are written. And that is definitely what I got. Most of them were very different to each other. I'll be honest, I don't remember how many of the stories I finished. I think I finished at least 2. I vaguely remember the rest of them. I remember the one by Tanith Lee. That was quite interesting because it was the sort of setting where I couldn't quite place it. It was halfway between being in our world and being in a fairy tale. So I enjoyed that sort of juxtaposition. That dealt with your typical fae bargains, which is always a cool take. I like to see how people deal with that. I read Megan Lindholm's, or Robin Hobbs, which was nothing like anything I've ever read by her because it was contemporary. But that had to do with a brownie and sort of the dark side of brownies. That was quite cool. And I enjoyed that take on it, even though it was contemporary. Then we had 2, I can't remember who they were by, but we had 2 vaguely Edwardian ones. And I think what I've discovered about my tastes in short stories is that if you're going to advertise a short story to me, I need it to be short. I need it to not feel like you're setting up a novel. I want it to be very clear about where the story's going, how quickly we're getting through it, and like I need it to be a satisfying ending. So whenever I read anthologies, I always have 2 bookmarks. I have one for where I've read up to and one that marks out where the story ends, so I know how much of the book I've got left, because I don't like not knowing how much of the book I've got left, or story, as it may be. I DNF'd the first one because I thought it had finished already, and then it started again. It was like trying to tell 3 or 4 stories in one short story, and that felt like a bit of a cop-out. So I DNF'd, like I read the first chunk and was like, yeah, okay, fine, it's a short story. And then it just sort of carried on and tried to tag on another plot line, and I didn't have time for that, so I DNF'd that one. There was another, I don't really remember the rest of them, but there was one more that I quite liked that was epistolary. So it was letters sent between 2, in my head they were hags. I don't know if they were actually described as hags or if that was just the vibe I got, who had been kicked out of the Fae realm for reasons that we didn't know, and sort of talking about aspects of their life, and some odd things cropped up and it sounded like they were about to go back into the business of kidnapping children, and that was quite cool. I just really wasn't in the headspace for it, so I think that's where I put the book down. I think if I picked it up again in the future, it would be to finish off that story or just reread it, because that one I was interested in, the rest of them not so much. But that was The Fair Folk, so I counted that as a DNF because I only read a couple of the stories. I ended up just sort of putting it down, and I don't really want to go near it again in the near future. Then I DNF'd Record of a Spaceborne Few. This is the third book in the Wayfarers series by Becky Chambers. I was not aware until I read the second book that this series doesn't follow the same people that we meet in the first book, because I loved the people that we met in the first book, and what I wanted was more of them. I didn't really care about the world that had been set up. I didn't want to go through and have to learn to love new characters. So I liked the second one because there were some sort of secondary, tertiary characters involved in that plot line. But for the third one, it seemed to me to be completely different. It was also following a human settlement, which is not the bit of the universe that we're introduced that I'm interested in. I don't really care about humans. Like, if you're going to tell me a sci-fi story, I want to hear about aliens. So I DNF'd that book, and I don't think I'll be continuing with the series. One of my DNFs was for Mixtape, so I won't be telling you about that one. But my next one was Confessions, Kane Minato. I read this on ebook on my Kindle. This was my sort of lunchtime reading book. And it was sold to me as something horrible happens to a high school teacher's daughter, and the high school teacher gets revenge, and the children in her class may or may not be involved. That was the story I wanted. That was only the first chunk of the story, and it wasn't really clear where the rest of the story was going. It felt like, again, multiple stories being told when I was only advertised one. It was also told in a funny way. It was told in... The first chunk was told in second person, and then the second chunk where I DNF'd it was told as if someone was writing a letter to someone else. So it was a bit sort of, it jumped around a bit in the way that the stories were being told, and I found that quite jarring. I also found it confusing trying to work out who was who, because the writing was really interesting because it sort of dropped details here and there, but so matter-of-factly that you had to sort of think about it for a second and then go back to it and go, hold on, that's actually a big deal, that's a huge red flag, why did you say that so nonchalantly? And from a character standpoint, it was quite refreshing to have characters that were so unabashedly ashamed of these objectively very bad opinions that they had and defending really quite poor actions. Yeah, it's a weird book. It's a bit of a mindfuck. Not for me. Tried it. I'm good. I didn't want to finish that one. And then I DNF'd The Liar's Knot by M.A. Carrick. This is the second book in the trilogy of The Rook and the Rose. I really enjoyed the first book, and I kind of feel like it could have stopped at the first book if they had wanted to. This is one of the most dense epic fantasies I have read in a long time. There is a seriously complicated setup, loads of characters that all have multiple names, multiple titles, in language that includes letters that are not Anglophone, so they're sort of Eastern European, Czech inspired language, I think. So there is sort of a guide to how you pronounce certain letters with the accents at the beginning, which is very helpful, but it still took that extra cog in my brain to then process the names on the page and then work out who was who, because they get referred to by a million names. And the main character herself has like 4 different identities, which is also very confusing because she's running a con and even she is getting confused as to which characters know her by which identities and whether or not they know that the identities are the same person or not. And then other people have multiple identities, and like, it's all very confusing. And I didn't really understand the implications of the ending of the last book, because it was one of those endings where I was getting swept up in like, oh, everyone's panicking and they're running around and things are happening and I don't really understand what's going on, but I'm being swept away with it anyway. And then things happened and I just didn't understand the bigger implications of that. And maybe that's a me thing, maybe I should have studied the book more, but frankly, if the book takes that much brain power to read, I don't have space for that in my life right now. I like slightly simpler books. So I've put that down because the second book was chunkier than the first book and the third book was chunkier than the second. And I don't have space for that. Also, I only really liked one character and she wasn't really in it as much as I wanted her to be. So, Tess. for any of you that have read the series. Yeah, so I put that one down. I didn't have the brain space for that. And that was it for DNFs. Moving on to the 2 stars. Okay, so the first 2-star that I read this month was How to Kill Your Family by Bella Mackie. This book, I think I've already put out an Instagram post about this book. I read this book. I was quite excited for it. I'd heard of some people reading it. It sort of floated. I knew of it in my sort of peripheral circles on the internet, and I found it in TK Maxx for a £5, and I was quite impressed that I had found it. And then I found the audiobook on Spotify, so I listened to the audiobook. This is a story about Grace taking revenge on her father's family for the wrongdoings that she perceives that they have done. She is a completely unreliable narrator. She is a distinctly horrible person. I would say she's a narcissist, verging on sociopathic, but I don't know. There were sort of sociopathic tendencies sprinkled in. I mean, she killed a whole fucking bunch of people. You've got to be some kind of sociopathic to do that the way that she did, because this book was literally just one murder after another, and how she planned it out and how she got entry to various places and all the sneaking around. She had me at the first murder. I was intrigued. Those people deserved to die. They were horrible people. She lost me at the second one, and after that I was just so baffled by the lengths that she was going to kill these people. I was just sort of hate reading it after that, because I didn't like her. I didn't really like the people she was killing, but I also couldn't see the motivation or understand the motivation that she was going so far out of her way to create these absolutely unhinged ways of killing people. And I won't spoil it, but then there's the bit at the end, but it's not really the bit with her friend, if you know what I mean, just seemed pointless. Like, I didn't really understand why that happened, and I don't understand why the end happened. That twist was shit and bad and convenient, and just sort of left me going, well, what the fuck was the point of any of that? So I hate read that, and I gave it a 2, and I don't recommend you read it. If you want to hate read it, by all means, go ahead, but it's not fucking worth it otherwise. I don't get along with books where I don't like the characters, I think is my takeaway from that. And maybe I should have DNF'd it, but this was a case of I just had the audiobook and I have a very long commute, so it was like, hate read it, or try not to fall asleep on the bus. My next 2-star... the last 2 books I read were 2 stars, to be fair. I read Between Ink and Shadows by Melissa Wright. This was on Scribd. This was part of the whole trilogy was on Scribd, but I only listened to the first book because it was bad and I don't want to continue the series. Nothing happened in this book. The events of this book that took me 6 hours or something to listen to, might not have been that long. I don't know how long it took me to listen to it. But the events of this quite short book could have happened in 3 chapters if she was doing a good job of writing it. There were characters in there that did not need to be in there. There were explanations that absolutely should have happened much, much earlier on and didn't, and therefore made me very frustrated. The main character herself felt like the ball in a game of ping pong between 2 men with too much power, and she wouldn't fight back for any reason that I could see, and that was infuriating and I didn't like it. Again, I finished it because it was on audio. And then I read The Witch of Eye by Catherine Nernberger, which I didn't really know what this was going into it, which is on me, I guess. It is a collection of essays roughly centred around different witches throughout history, but linked to the personal life of Catherine Nernberger. And I'll be honest, a lot of them just felt like ways for her to shit on her husband in public, possibly ex-husband. It got a bit confusing. She jumped around as if we knew who she was and everything about her life. And I know nothing about this lady, so it didn't make a lot of sense. I was mainly in it to hear about different witches throughout the ages because I thought that would be cool. It wasn't super cool. It was mostly just sad. Which again, on me, I really should have expected it to just be a sad book. I thought the anecdotes would make it a bit more interesting, but it didn't. It confused me and frustrated me, so I didn't enjoy that book at all. and I think someone needed to go back through and edit it a bit more heavily. That might have improved it a bit. Moving on to the 3 stars. There was one 3-star. I'm going to break away from my star ratings now because I read the first 5 books in the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire, and I rated them 5, 5, 4, 4 and 3, I think, as we go further through the series. These were on Scribd, which was great, and I just read them, like, I fucking devoured these books. I love this series. This series follows the children who go to Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children school? Something like that. It's called something like that. It's run by Eleanor West. Basically, it's a school for children who have been through doorways to other worlds and come back and are waiting for their doorways to appear again so they can go back to the other worlds. It is a really cool concept that Seanan McGuire does really well. It's a series of novellas and they don't follow chronologically on from one another. So the first one sets up the school and introduces you to a couple of people, and then the next one is just the story of one of the children and their world and how they got into it and came out of it. And then the one after that will be back at the school. It sort of switches timelines that way, but I don't mind it. I thought that was quite good. And the worlds that these children go to are described on a scale of nonsense to logic and wickedness to virtue, and they fall somewhere on that scale. And then where I'm at, they've mentioned sort of smaller scales as well that I haven't really gotten into. But all the character work in this series is really, really good because all the children are so distinct. They all have such distinct motivations. They feel like real people, but they also still feel like children, which I think is really important because they are teenagers, if not younger, most of the time, and they make the choices that children and teenagers would make in that situation. And because all the characters are so wildly different, all the worlds are also wildly different because, like, we go to the moors where there is a vampire master and the equivalent of Frankenstein working out of a windmill, sort of battling it out and keeping the balance in that place. And then we have Candyland, where everything is made of sugar and rainbows and candy floss. And then there's the Goblin Market, which I have a bone to pick with the Goblin Market book, in the fact that there wasn't enough of the Goblin Market, and that really upset me, because if you're going to advertise a book as having a Goblin Market, the Goblin Market in it, like that's a place in mythology and lore that exists. I want you to do a good job. The story in itself was good. It was fine, but I was really disappointed by how little there was of the actual market that was in that book. The concept of bartering and fair value, fantastic. Loved that. Actual market, not so much. Any goblins? No, there were no goblins. Unless I missed them, but there were no goblins. That was really disappointing. I think that was the one I gave a 3. I can't remember. I would really recommend the series. I'm waiting for Scribd to let me carry on reading them because apparently there is also a reading limit on Scribd that I didn't know about. I think they have 2 tiers of books because as soon as I had read 5 of the Wayward Children books, it cut me off, and it also cut off the other books that are sort of more popular and more well known than the other ones in their catalogue. So I think they might cut you off if you read too many of the popular books, which I can understand, but also irritates the shit out of me. But it is also better than just 15 hours of audiobook listening time. Listening to audiobooks is like a game. It's like you have to strategize which sites you're going to, because no, I don't think I can access them through my library. My library isn't that good. Annoying, but there we go. Really enjoyed that series. I've got 1 4-star before I talk about my 5 stars, which was Anatomy of Love Story. I wasn't expecting to like that one because it looks like it might be a bit wishy-washy and YA-y, and it could have gone horribly wrong because it's about the well-off daughter of, I think it was a count or a duke or someone living outside Edinburgh, who was completely overshadowed by her younger brother and the death of her older brother. So she kind of just got to run around doing what she wanted. And what she wanted was to be a surgeon. And so she would find bodies and dissect them in the dungeons of this castle that she lived in, which I enjoyed. And then there were also these surgeons operating in the city in a school, and she wanted to learn how to be a surgeon. And it's about her navigating the betrothal that she's had to her family friend since she was basically born, that she doesn't really take seriously, and the fact that she's getting closer and closer to being 18 and actually having to worry about what's going to happen in her future, and the way that she acts will actually have consequences, and learning that. And then also discovering a really quite nasty set of murders and the intrigue and mystery behind that, and there are some very nasty people doing very nasty things, and I actually really enjoyed it. The audiobook, which I started off listening to, was pretty good, and I had the physical, I finished it off in physical form, and I really enjoyed it, and I will be reading the second one, so I recommend that book. It was very good. And then my 5 stars, I read, finally finished, In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. This threw me for a loop. I listened to the audiobook of this, and it's about Yeonmi, who is a North Korean defector, basically. She's just had a second book come out, so you might have seen her doing interviews and press and stuff for that, which is why I picked up the first book. I won't be reading the second one just because I feel like the first was enough, but it was 5 stars. It felt like I was reading fiction, because North Korea is so batshit and terrifying, the things that happen there. And it's so sad and horrible and everything you would think it was. And the book itself is just heart-wrenching, but it's also so matter-of-fact and realistic. And she just lays out everything that happened and their motivations and their feelings through every step of the way. The things that happened to her were horrible. She's in a better place at the end of the book than she was at the start, which is what we want from a book like that. And I believe she is doing quite a lot of work in sort of getting the truth out there as well, which I think is very important, because North Korea is a terrifying place with terrifying people at its head. Some of the stuff she was saying was very hard to believe, but I highly, highly recommend giving this book a read if you want more information on that subject. I also read Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. This was also 5 stars. This book felt like Howl's Moving Castle. It was such an interesting take, because it follows the main character, whose name I've forgotten, who has had half of her soul stolen by an elf, because her cousin interrupted the theft by stabbing the elf with a pair of scissors. So she's missing half a soul, which means she presents, what does she miss? Because she's not missing empathy. She's missing, it's written really well. She's missing sort of aspects of, she doesn't care about a lot of things that other people care about. In some ways she does present as autistic, which I found quite interesting. But although it is frowned upon by her dickhead of an aunt, the aunt is a dickhead, so you kind of expect that to happen. And there is a brooding Howl-esque love interest who is exactly what you want him to be. He is Howl in every sense of the word, in that he puts on like a brooding persona, but in fact does have a very serious like project that he's working on that is very near and dear to his heart. And the main character, I've completely forgotten her name, sort of pulls out the soft side of him bit by bit. And there are some really good side characters and a really good depiction of fairy as well. I really, really liked it. It's a short book as well, so I'd highly recommend it if you're looking for something that feels like reading Howl's Moving Castle again, but better. It's also set in like the Regency era. Then I read one more 5-star book, but I read it for Mixtape-a-thon, so I will leave that there and let you hear about that one in my mixtape vlog. I think, have I missed anything? I think that was all the books that I read in November. A real fucking mix there. Like, it was a fucking roller coaster. I never knew what was going to happen, but also a really good reading month, because I'm really getting into the audiobooks and I have so much time to read the audiobooks. So there we go. Let me know if you've read any of these, if you feel the same way, if you have differing opinions on any of them. I am interested to know, particularly about Confessions. I'd like to know if anyone's read that and had the same sort of impressions as I did, so do let me know. But yeah, that was another video. I hope you had a good reading month in November as well, and I will see you next month.